If anyone's watching this and you're an aspiring young athlete, don't do what these people are doing when they're at the top.
You know, there's so much money in this supplement industry, is that a lot of the times they're getting paid to do this.
The reason that they're good is because they're good at the sport, not because of what they're eating. We're going through the latest research in sports nutrition news that was posted. So this was the most requested study and commented on study that we had from our recent posts. So this is the one that looked at energy availability in rugby players.
The main thing for me with the methods is that it's not a huge population that they're using for this study, which then, you know, you'd probably need to have a look at some other studies, but then somewhat questions the reliability of it and the validity of it, I guess, depending on the 12 players, their environment, you know, what their financial situation is like, you know, the socioeconomic status, you know, and the way that they train as well. Are they at an elite rugby school? Are they at just an average school but on the elite team? But I think the main thing that stands out to me is just that number of students that you have is 12 players.
Yeah, sample size is very interesting. It's a 7-day prospective observational. So depending on what happens in the 7 days, like, you know, like that's interesting as well. But I mean, it's good that we're getting this stuff. I also found it interesting because, you know, like they wanted to measure adolescent rugby players for this. Like, what were they hoping to see? To me, like obviously we're just looking at EA. It'd be cool to see some like other correlative data that we could use to triangulate and draw, you know, further conclusions or additional correlational or causational relationships with, you know, like if we had access to like a DEXA as well. The energy intake was assessed using weighed food by dietitian in a cafe, which is good. Like the controls for that are awesome. That's really good. And image-based dietary, like for recovery days. Some of the apps that do image-based stuff now can do it very, very accurately. So we're not sitting here going, oh yeah, this is 7-day food recall and like talking about the limitations associated with that. So I think in terms of the quantification of the food and how reliable that is, I think we can say that's like fairly reliable. Outside of that, it'd be interesting to see how they calculated fat-free mass. Was it DEXA? Was it, you know, 7-site skin fold, 3-site skin fold, bioimpedance, you know, because there's degrees of error associated with those. But, you know, it is what it is. Now we're on to the results side of things.
Yeah. So the main thing of the results is that was really interesting for me, and two things that stood out was the relationship between the training days and recovery days and the way the EA kind of shifted between those 2 days, which was really interesting at the difference of approximately maybe an EA of 35, give or take, on a heavy training day compared to a recovery day, which we had an EA of about 47.8, which is significantly higher. Across most days, I'd want to say their training and recovery days, it was a bit of a lower carbohydrate day. Now, 5 grams per kilo is not significantly low, but definitely on the lower end considering their type of sport and where they should be. And then high protein, which was all good, and then high fat as well, which was really interesting when that came out to then assess their energy availability, particularly when we're looking here as well.
Yeah, I think that's super interesting. I have a couple of comments on this. One is around the macronutrients, like the carbs. I think that's abysmal, and the high fat is like, I'm not a fan of it at all. Like, this isn't to call these athletes out, but it's like people look up to them. Like they see Quade Cooper's doing it and Sonny Bill, you know, are doing it. I was watching some video on YouTube recently and Sonny Bill's, you know, having his, you know, MCT oil with his butter in his coffee and his like, you know, cold drip coffee, and he's getting ready for a fight and something. Like, the thing that if anyone's watching this and you're an aspiring young athlete, don't do what these people are doing when they're at the top. Don't model the peak. Model the climb. And I think that's something that a lot of people just aren't doing and taking into consideration. So it's like, when someone's a world-class athlete, that's awesome, and we should pay attention to what they're doing. But let's also critically think and appraise what they're doing at the top now that they're at the top versus what they were doing when they were getting there. Because what's more relevant to you is more likely what they did in the climb to get there than what they're doing at the very top. And so I would like to see the carbs almost double and the fats basically almost half. Yeah, like a gram of fat and like, you know, 8 to 10 grams of carbs a day, like per kilogram of body weight. And I'd like to see 1 gram of fat a day. That's what I would like to see for these athletes.
I mean, particularly before a heavy training day, I'd probably recommend anywhere between 8 to 10 grams per kilo body weight of carbs at minimum. Moderate, you probably could get away with like 6 to 8, probably 8 on a moderate, but 5 would probably be something that I would recommend on a lower training day or a recovery day if you're really going to split all of them up really, really specifically. But just to touch on what you mentioned earlier as well, I think a good thing to consider, and a thing to consider particularly for young athletes as well, looking up to these elite athletes like, Sonny Bill and things like that, not only in rugby, in all sports as well, is when you get to that level, when they're promoting these sorts of supplements, and there's so much money in this supplement industry, is that a lot of the times they're getting paid to do this, and a lot of the times they're being sold this like particular products, and some are great, some are not so great. I don't know if a lot of athletes will look into how effective these supplements or products are, or really understand them in an in-depth way before they actually go ahead and use it or take the payday and then promote it. I'd definitely say consider the basics, consider the science first before looking at any of that supplementation stuff at the top, or, any of that stuff like the MCT oils, or those products.
Yeah, and that's the thing. It's like, again, if you model the climb, it's like the reason that they're good is because they're good at the sport, not because of what they're eating. Because their diets have changed like 10 times in the last, 10 years or however long it's been for the people. And you know what's been constant the whole time? Their play. Doesn't matter what they were doing, their play was good. So like nutrition matters, but athletes being good at the craft matters more. So like just keep that in mind. The other interesting thing was around like looking at the EA. Like there's like a couple of conclusions that we could, I'm not going to say like draw like really strongly, but we could take away that there's two things that sort of stand out to me. They could be having like a bit of a standardized like food intake that they just have. And so they're not then eating more on the higher days. And so that's what's creating that gap, depending on just how intensive and how energetically expensive those training sessions are. Or it could be a combination of them not eating more on those days and then also eating more on the rest days when they're not doing anything. And we know that in some cases, exercise will suppress appetite on days depending on the nature of the exercise and activity, right? And even if it doesn't and you have the same amount of appetite, but you just don't feel like eating during that training session is 2 hours long, then, and you're like, let's say you sleep for 8 hours, that means that like 16 hours of the day you're awake, you would normally have a 16-hour feeding window on a rest day. That feeding window has now reduced to a 14-hour feeding window from there. So like we can see some increases in rest days as a result of that. Does that mean that we would be recommending that they go high carb on the heavy day, moderate carb on the moderate day, and low carb on the rest, or whatever it is? No. And if, especially in like 15-year-old adolescent males, like we wouldn't worry about it. We would just have, these are the principles, eat the same stuff. And probably the only difference that we would have is on your like heavy training days, have 2 things of sports drink. Have one before and during, or one during and one after, something like that. And then on the moderate day, it might just be 1 sports drink. And then on the rest day, you just don't have the sports drink. And then the food would basically be the same. That's what we would do to just keep it simple. Conclusion-wise, what did you have here on this, Jackie? Pretty
much just everything that we've talked about is just that the carbohydrate is the key thing throughout this whole study, and that being low will really impact them, particularly, like I said, with their sport and with the energy demands and the energy systems that they will be using. Definitely needing that carbs to be increased. So the other thing as well is not only for their sport and performance, but also for growth. Being adolescent, being 15, that they are still growing, and they're definitely needing those carbohydrates to facilitate that growth and through puberty and everything as well. So that's definitely a key area of something that I would consider if these were my clients.
Yeah, I think the only thing I'd add to this is it's like, I don't like this sentence in the conclusion, the final one. These results highlight the short-term inadequacy of energy availability as a result of low-carb intake. Warning, this is where I don't like it from here, warning about the possible adverse short-term metabolic effects on health and performance of young athletes. I just challenge that pretty strongly because the short-term effects, metabolic effects on health and performance, they're not that huge for short-term low EA. Like these are things that you can live with. Long-term low EA, chronically low EA, you're going to really experience some bad metabolic and physiological effects of that. So to me, this is just me personally, and like good on you to the authors. You're doing this amazing work and getting it published and bringing the field forward, and all I'm doing is commentating on this stuff. So I'm an armchair expert. Take this with a grain of salt, but like a massive grain of salt. But it reads a bit fear-mongery. If I were writing that, I would have just said to be, warning about the possible adverse effects associated with low energy availability on metabolic health and performance in young athletes, and especially be mindful of that turning into chronic or something like that. Like something to basically say that like, we really don't want this in the like mid to long term. Yes, there's going to be some negative impacts in the short term, but like they're not going to be too bad. Like maybe in adolescent young men, and this is stuff that we need more research in, it's like, what happens? Are they more resilient because of the hormones? Or are they less resilient because there's so much hormones and they're growing so much and they need the additional recovery, and now we're compromising that recovery? These are things that we don't have the answers to and for at the moment, but that's the stuff that like, based on if we had those answers, then I would say, you know, like we could go harder at short term, but based on the research that we have at the moment on, you know, negative impacts in the short term associated with like low energy availability, it's not super low. I wouldn't even really consider them low.
No.
For one, and even if it were low, I'm not too worried about short-term effects. So that's that. So all in all, I think like it's a cool study. It brings things forward. Yeah, that's my 2 cents. You got anything else to add?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. That was something that I was going to touch on, is although it says low, I wouldn't class 38 as low. It's definitely lower than 47, particularly 47 being on a recovery day compared to 38 being on a heavy training day. But it's not like the EA is at 15 or anything like that, or anything that I would be particularly concerned about. As well as that, with that low carbohydrate intake, it's not dramatically low. And I think, speaking to sports nutritionists, that's something really interesting and important to understand when you are interpreting these studies, is that when you go through this and you see that these studies are saying, okay, they have low energy availability, or energy availability is lower on these training days, we have to consider what does that mean, and how does that impact the client? Because we don't want to just jump to the conclusion, because if we kind of just jumped and only read that conclusion, you'd probably assume that this is probably a bit of a big deal. Whereas then if you look at everything all together, and considering this isn't even the entire study and all the details of the study, this is only the abstract, you're going to get a lot more detail, particularly around the results of what that actually looks like for the client. So a big takeaway that I would recommend is definitely take everything that you read online with a grain of salt, and definitely go do your own study about interesting research that you see as well, and go read through everything.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. It's like we ran a workshop on AI and how to use AI today. And I think this comes back to it as well. Like the analogy that we used, or that I introduced, was like, you really need to spend time with it to like be able to work out what it's good at, what it sucks at, how to get the most out of it. And so a lot of the people in the like digital AI space and like digital influencer AI space are saying like, you need to interface with it for about 150 hours to get good at it. Just on this, you know, do we change anything? No. I would say like all we would be doing for 15-year-old male aspiring rugby players is making sure they're getting decent protein. Well, looking at that, they are. Making sure they're getting in their plants, plenty of fruit and veg, and then making sure they're fueling adequately and recovering well. So, you know, as a practitioner, what would we do from here? 2 things a sports drink on the heavy training days, 1 on the regular training day, no sports drink on the recovery day. That's pretty much it if they're getting plants and protein and calories in from good sources from there.